Welcome to Lesson 2, IHSS Timesheet Violation Training, Monthly Overtime Violation. In this lesson, we will discuss what causes a violation, monthly overtime, and provide examples of monthly overtime violations. What causes a violation? There are 4 ways that a violation can occur. The provider works more than 40 hours in a work week for a recipient whose maximum weekly hours are 40 or less without receiving county approval. The provider exceeds the recipient's maximum weekly hours, causing the provider to work more overtime than the provider normally works without receiving county approval. The provider works more than the maximum weekly limit of 66 hours when working for multiple recipients, or the provider claims more than 7 hours of travel time in a work week. In this lesson, we will be taking a closer look at the violation for working more than a recipient's maximum weekly hours without the recipient getting approval from the county, which caused you to work more overtime hours in the month than you normally would. It is important to know how overtime is determined. Overtime is paid for any hours the provider works over 40 during a work week. When working for one recipient, if the provider's assigned hours for their recipient equal 160 or less, the provider is not authorized to work any overtime hours. Let's take a closer look at the monthly overtime violation. This means that providers have a limit to the amount of overtime they can claim during a month. For example, if a provider is working for a recipient and is assigned 240 hours per month, the provider is allowed up to 80 overtime hours per month. The 80 hours are calculated like this: 240 minus 160 equals 80. Because providers have a limit to the amount of overtime hours they can claim during a month, it is important for providers to track the amount of overtime hours claimed for each work week during a month. Work week overtime hours are the amount of hours claimed for that work week minus 40. We will take a look at 2 examples of violations that are caused by claiming more than the allowed overtime hours for the month. 1. We will take a look at a violation caused by working more than a recipient's maximum weekly hours and more overtime hours than allowed. And 2, the provider is working for only one recipient and the recipient has 283 authorized monthly hours. In our first example, we will take a look at a violation caused by working more than a recipient's maximum weekly hours and more overtime hours than allowed. The provider is working for only one recipient, and the recipient has 240 authorized monthly hours. This means the provider has 60 weekly authorized hours. This also means the provider is allowed up to 80 monthly overtime hours. 240 minus 160 equals 80. Let's take a look at the Part A timesheet for the month. In the Part A timesheet, in Work Week 1, the provider claimed 66 hours. This gives the provider 26 hours of monthly overtime for Work Week 1. That is calculated by taking the 66 claimed hours and subtracting 40. In the Part A timesheet, in Work Week 2, the provider claimed 66 hours again. This too gives the provider 26 hours of monthly overtime. The last day of the pay period for Part A, the 15th of the month, falls under Work Week 3. The provider has claimed 10 hours for this day. This is an important 10 hours, and we will demonstrate why a little later. Now, let's check and see where the provider is with monthly overtime hours. For both Work Week 1 and Work Week 2, the provider claimed 26 hours of overtime. This is a total of 52 hours of overtime for the month for Part A of the month. The provider started with being allowed up to 80 hours of monthly overtime. Since the provider has already claimed 52 hours, this means they can claim 28 more overtime hours for the month. Now, Let's take a look at the Part B timesheet for the month. In the Part B timesheet in Workweek 1, the provider claimed 49 hours. But remember, the provider had claimed 10 hours from the Part A timesheet for the first day of this work week. When those 10 hours are added to the 49 claimed hours that are claimed for Workweek 1 on this timesheet, the provider gets 59 total claimed hours for this work week. This gives the provider 19 overtime hours for Workweek 1 on the Part B timesheet. The provider now has a total of 71 overtime hours for the month up to this point. In Workweek 2, for the Part B timesheet, the provider claimed 66 hours. This again is 26 hours of overtime for the week. When the 26 overtime hours are added to the running total of 71 overtime hours, the total becomes 97 monthly overtime hours. The provider has claimed 97 overtime hours. During Workweek 2 of the Part B timesheet, the provider received a violation because they claimed more than their allowed 80 monthly overtime hours. Let's recap. The provider was allowed up to 80 monthly overtime hours for the Part A timesheet. For both Workweek 1 and Workweek 2, the provider claimed 26 hours of overtime. This is a total of 52 hours of overtime for Part A of the month. For the Part B timesheet, for Workweek 1, the provider claimed 19 hours of overtime, and for Workweek 2, the provider claimed 26 hours of overtime. This is a total of 45 hours of overtime for Part B of the month. The 52 hours of overtime from Part A plus the 45 hours of overtime from Part B is a total of 97 overtime hours. The provider claimed a total of 97 overtime hours for the month. The provider was allowed up to a total of 80 overtime hours per month. The provider claimed more than their authorized monthly overtime hours by claiming more than the 60 maximum weekly hours. For Workweek 1, 66 claimed hours. For Workweek 2, 66 claimed hours. For Workweek 3, 59 claimed hours. For Workweek 4, 66 claimed hours. And for Workweek 5, 26 claimed hours. The provider claimed more than the 60 maximum weekly hours for 3 work weeks during this month. Because 97 overtime hours were claimed for this month, a violation was triggered. In some instances, it is possible for the provider to stay under their weekly maximum hours and still go over their allowed monthly overtime hours. In our second example, the provider is working for only one recipient, and the recipient has 283 authorized monthly hours. This means the provider has 70 hours and 45 minutes of weekly authorized hours. This also means the provider is allowed up to 123 monthly overtime hours. 283 minus 160 equals 123. Let's take a look at the Part A timesheet for the month. In the Part A timesheet in Workweek 1, the provider claimed 37 hours. However, for the first 3 days of this work week, the provider has claimed 33 hours from the previous timesheet. This gives the provider a total of 70 hours for this work week. This means the provider has claimed 30 hours of monthly overtime for Workweek 1. This is calculated by taking the 70 claimed hours and subtracting 40. In the Part A timesheet in Workweek 2, the provider claimed 67 hours and 30 minutes. This means the provider has claimed 27 hours and 30 minutes of monthly overtime for Workweek 2. This is calculated by taking the 67 hours and 30 minutes of claimed hours and subtracting 40. The last 4 days of the pay period for Part A fall under Workweek 3. The provider has claimed 37 hours for those days. This is an important 37 hours, and we will demonstrate why a little later. Now, let's check and see where the provider is with their monthly overtime hours. For work week 1, the provider claimed 30 hours of overtime, and for work week 2, the provider claimed 27 hours and 30 minutes of overtime. This gives the provider a total of 57 hours and 30 minutes of overtime for the month for Part A. The provider started the month being allowed up to 123 hours of monthly overtime. Since the provider already claimed 57 hours and 30 minutes, this means the provider can claim 65 hours and 30 minutes of overtime for the rest of the month. Now, let's take a look at the Part B timesheet for the month. In the Part B timesheet in Work Week 1, the provider claimed 30 hours. But remember, the provider had already claimed 37 hours from the Part A timesheet for this work week. When those 37 hours are added to the 30 claimed hours for Work Week 1 on this timesheet, there are 67 total claimed hours for this work week. This gives the provider 27 overtime hours for Work Week 1 on the Part B timesheet. The provider now has a total of 84 hours and 30 minutes of overtime hours for the month up to this point. In Work Week 2, for the Part B timesheet, the provider claimed 67 hours. This gives the provider 27 hours of overtime for the week. When those 27 overtime hours are added to the running total of 84 hours and 30 minutes of overtime, the total becomes 111 hours and 30 minutes of monthly overtime. In Work Week 3, for the Part B timesheet, the provider claimed 52 hours and 30 minutes. This gives the provider 12 hours and 30 minutes of overtime for the week. When those 12 hours and 30 minutes of overtime are added to the running total of 111 hours and 30 minutes, the total becomes 124 hours of monthly overtime. Let's recap. The provider was allowed up to 123 monthly overtime hours for the Part A timesheet. For Work Week 1, the provider claimed 30 hours of overtime, and for Work Week 2, the provider claimed 27 hours and 30 minutes of overtime. This gives the provider a total of 57 hours and 30 minutes of overtime for the month for Part A. For the Part B timesheet, for Work Week 1, the provider claimed 27 hours of overtime. For Work Week 2, the provider claimed 27 hours of overtime, and for Work Week 3, the provider claimed 12 hours and 30 minutes of overtime. This is a total of 66 hours and 30 minutes of overtime for Part B of the month. The 57 hours and 30 minutes of overtime from Part A plus the 66 hours and 30 minutes of overtime from Part B is a total of 124 overtime hours. The provider claimed a total of 124 overtime hours for the month. The provider was allowed up to a total of 123 overtime hours for the month. The provider claimed more than their authorized monthly overtime hours, even though the provider did not claim more than the recipient's maximum weekly hours of 70 hours and 45 minutes in any work week for the month. Work Week 1, 70 claimed hours. Work Week 2, 67 hours and 30 minutes. For Work Week 3, 67 claimed hours. For Work Week 4, 67 claimed hours. And for Work Week 5, 52 hours and 30 minutes. This example demonstrates the importance of keeping track of the overtime hours for each work week within a given month. Because 124 overtime hours were claimed for this month, a violation was triggered. This concludes Lesson 2, IHSS Timesheet Violation Training, Monthly Overtime Violation. Please continue to view additional lessons in the training series to learn more about IHSS timesheet violation training.